Well, it wasn't perfect, but I'm not too proud to admit that Act 2 was leagues better than I was anticipating after Act 1. Pun not intended. Granted, for me, the bar was on the floor, so take my praise with that grain of salt. Where Act 1 was preoccupied with getting as much of the story established as possible, Act 2 was able to slow down and linger in its emotional moments and character conflicts a bit more. I went in with low expectations, and I was pleasantly surprised by the turnaround. Did it achieve the same depth that Season 1 had? For me, not quite, but it was certainly closer than this season's first act. Following my last review, I'm going to preface this video with a disclaimer as well as a brief concession rebuttal, because I think it's fair to speak up on my own behalf after the responses my first video evoked. So, disclaimer, this video is going to contain opinions that are critical of the show in ways you might not agree with. If you're passionate about this show and will be upset listening to someone express a differing opinion, I urge you to click off this video and maybe find a video praising the season instead. My goal isn't to rage bait. My goal is to express my discontent with aspects of the show that I feel could have been better, because that's how I engage with media that I'm passionate about. You're welcome to disagree with me, but I do request that you be respectful to each other in the comments. To start, I want to acknowledge a few things about my review of Act 1. I know my first video was really heated, to put it in terms less generous to myself. Where I intended to use hyperbole to lighten the impact of my criticism, I understand that in a critical review that can come off less like comedy and more like blind hate. To phrase it less diplomatically, it's not that serious, guys. Several of you said I was nitpicking, and to a certain extent I absolutely agree. While I don't think my larger criticisms of the pacing and character motivations were that deep of a dig, I am definitely putting Season 2 under a microscope. But that's only because Season 1 provided us with such a high-quality lens through which to inspect its story. That is to say, Season 1 was amazing, and I very rarely felt discontent with the story, even within the finest details. It follows that the viewer should be able to expect the same standard of quality throughout the rest of the show. Having graduated with a degree in animation and creative writing, I feel equipped to assure you all that critique is an imperative part of the artistic process. Nitpicking is how you reach the standard of quality that Season 1 presented. Digging deep into every single character motivation, narrative device, and artistic decision is how you refine a story to its highest quality. Artists gain nothing by settling for mediocrity, and neither does the viewer. If it is your preference to enjoy the show without a critical lens, that is entirely your right. Similarly, I am entirely within my rights to criticize this show down to the finest details, and if you disagree, go ahead and make your own video. But without further ado, let's get into the meat of this review. I still stand by everything I said about Act 1 in my last video because I think those flaws have done irreparable damage to the pace of the rest of the show. That said, I'm glad to see that nature is healing following that natural disaster, and I'm tentatively hopeful that we may still manage a fairly satisfying ending yet. Act 2 pretty much confirmed my suspicions that Act 1 was being used to speedrun all of the buildup of the story so that we could reach the climax of the finale. It's clear to me that the show was written with more than 2 seasons in mind, and now that the time allowed to tell the story has been cut, the meat of the story was condensed into 3 episodes in order to set up all the needed context for the end of the show. Unlike Season 1, which used its first arc to really root us in our characters and their motivations and the whys necessary to establish the rest of the show, Season 2 used its first arc to establish the whats. As a result, even though we jump into Arc 2 with a reasonable time skip and much healthier pacing, I end up feeling like I've fast-forwarded past the middle of a film, jumping from beginning to end and only catching glimpses of the intended narrative in the little preview box that pops up as I scrub through the timeline. The pacing that has improved so much still feels odd because of how it presents in the context of the previous arc. The characters' motivations feel more two-dimensional than they would have if they'd been given the proper amount of time to build up. Jinx takes up the majority of the screen time, which I don't mind on its own, but after the last arc was so condensed, the imbalance is definitely noticeable. While using Act 1 to cram all of the context for the end of the show is certainly the best case scenario as opposed to the entire season being a crash course, it still makes it feel like we missed several seasons worth of development between the end of Season 1 and the start of Season 2's second arc. Many of the payoffs still managed to be impactful because of how Act 2 was willing to slow down and dig back into its characters, but they would have been more impactful to me if we'd had the time to get to these payoffs organically. Even so, I'm glad the writers did what they could to make those payoffs happen, even if it felt like some of the narrative threads were thinner than I would have wanted them to be. One of the things I liked about this season was the predictability. I know that sounds like a negative, but I don't mean to say that this arc was linear and easy to anticipate. Specifically, I noticed a few things that I liked that were successfully foreshadowed. Mel's survival in Act 1 was one of these predictable but effective turnouts, and the follow-up on whatever magic she's got going on made sense. Vander calming down at the sight of Jinx and then being used to bring her and Vi together? Of course we saw it coming, but it made sense with their characters, and we all wanted it to happen, so I'm definitely not complaining. Singe's specific dialogue here,
"Why does anyone commit acts others deem unspeakable?"
had me guessing,
"For love."
before he even said it, and I loved it. This is exactly what I wanted out of him. After spending the whole show lurking in the shadows, I'm thrilled to finally see what makes him tick. The drunkard being Vi's emotional support was a fun detail we saw coming right from his introduction, even though it only lasted for about 5 seconds until he gave up. Caitlyn betraying Mbessa by pretending to lock up Vi was framed in a way that made it obvious they were acting here. And even though I have other complaints about this sequence of events, the predictability isn't one of them. Isha becoming the source of Jinx's healing deserves its own paragraph, if not its own video, but for now I'll just say she pretty much fulfilled her narrative purpose. Regarding the other extremely predictable turnout for Isha, well, we'll get to that too. Alternatively, this was unpredictable in the worst way. Like, girl! Like, okay, I'm exaggerating because looking back, it's so obvious that Maddie had the biggest heart on for Caitlyn and that everything she's done up to this point was with big old hearts in her eyes, but I'm still just, I feel so betrayed. God! I'm so happy to say that between its backgrounds, fight scenes, and artistic diversity, this arc has far surpassed any complaints I had coming off Act 1. While I mentioned previously that the backgrounds in Part 1 felt empty or uninteresting to me, I have to suspect it's because a lot of the budget for this season's backgrounds was diverted to those in Act 2. The return to Stillwater, while appropriately grim and foggy, was a nice combination of wide open spaces and cramped prison halls. I love the way the mining tunnels, which could have just been a series of oppressing caves, became a whimsical and interactive environment with the inclusion of those percussive little glow mushrooms. All other things being equal, the commune was a sight to behold. The hardest thing for me to reconcile with that location was the intense sunlight reaching all the way down into the fissure, but I think that's at least partially because the way that place looked before made me think it was some kind of vast, foggy underground cavern, instead of what appears to be like a canyon or a ravine that opens up somewhere far above. And of course, watching everything wither and die after our doomed yaoi breakup Part 2 was a nice touch. The fights were another place where I thought Act 2 managed a bit of a comeback. Where I felt that Act 1 was lacking in a lot of the visceral throwdowns that made Season 1 so powerful, Act 2 made sure to get right up close and personal. Jinx's fight with Warwick was appropriately gritty, with high stakes and a cramped environment that immediately put Jinx on the back foot. It's probably my favorite fight of this season so far for those reasons alone, to say nothing of their choreography. The fight made great use of Jinx's shimmer power-ups in a way I found lacking in Act 1. Other highlights included Vi getting her shit fucked in the pit, Vi and Jinx having their tumble and Isha getting caught up in it, and of course, Isha's final shot.
Welcome back to me screaming.
It was also cool to see Caitlyn join the Fire Nation. There were still a few times when I felt like we were falling back on those wide promo shots, but I was more willing to forgive those when they felt like they were additionally serving as an effort to let the viewer linger on the emotional impact. Or maybe I'm just feeling more generous this time around, I don't know. By far the most impactful visuals for me this arc had to be the moments the show diverged from its typical art style. Unlike the charcoal funeral slideshow that I was decidedly not a fan of from Act 1, these artistic choices really enhanced my experience of the scenes they were involved in instead of distracting from them. And I have absolutely no complaints about their visuals or their placement or how they were handled or anything. The first scenes that really jumped out to me were the Warwick tracking shots. The blood red vision and dissociative quality of each frame really hammered home the animalistic inhumanity of the hunt. It kind of reminded me of the Shearshoe POV shots from Avatar, which makes me realize this is the second Avatar reference I've made in this video. I wonder if I could... Next up was Vander's memory sequence, and other than Victor and Sky serving Secret of the Wings of Winter Fairy, I really liked how the horrific labyrinth of his mind was illustrated. The watercolor style animation used for his happier memories was definitely the star of the show, and I found it far preferable to any standard flashback sequence that might have taken its place had the show been handled by a less artistically inclined team. The music really pulled the whole thing together, which again wasn't something I was able to confidently say for a lot of the scenes in Act 1. And finally, of course, the best use of artistic experimentation in the season yet, Isha's memories. I am not immune to a happy memory sequence before a character's incoming demise. And while the show could have given us that memory sequence in its typical 3D, the choice to animate those flashbacks in a colorful, scribbly, less rendered style achieved the perfect feeling of seeing through the eyes of a child, which was unforgivable, by the way. I'm suing for emotional damages. Other than the art, there were a few more things I liked from this season. I loved this 2024 release of Beauty and the Beast, both for its visuals and for the way it spoke to Victor's humanity, which was kind of hard to pin down after the Hex Core fusion. On the topic of Victor, I also loved getting to see him interact with Jinx. Would have been cool to see how they interacted before he ascended to Nirvana, but their dynamic after the fact was just as fun to watch in a different way.
Looks like you got a couple.
I've always been Jace's #1 hater, mostly because I just find men annoying, and he so often demonstrates those traits that within men I find most profoundly annoying, but I am not immune to a man whose body and mind wastes away via the torment of existential knowledge beyond that which is able to be comprehended by the human mind. But best of all, I'm so happy to say that the Caitlyn and Vi tension is so back, baby! I had plenty of complaints about the kiss scene, and I stand by every single one, because just look at this shit. That fucking burlap sack contained more sexual tension than the literal spit swapping they managed 3 episodes ago. And speaking of swapping spit.
Welcome back to me screaming.
Do I think Caitlyn turned traitor too fast? Most definitely, but this isn't about that right now. This is about how asking your ex to hit you in the face with the butt of her rifle has never looked so hot. No more questions. Moving on. I wish I could stop the video here and say I only had positive feedback for Act 2, but I don't roll like that. That said, here's your last call to click off if you only wanted to hear the good things, because it's time to get critical. The episode 4 PMV intro served to establish our time skip and catch us up on what Piltover has looked like under martial law, but personally, I wasn't a fan. We spent a lot of time staring into Caitlyn's pensive gaze while everyone with blue hair and pronouns was rounded up at the camps, and while I appreciate the glimpse into the future that Republicans want, it happened so quickly that it didn't really establish the full extent of oppression that I felt was trying to be conveyed. We see more of the security checkpoint later in the show, where Mbessa's goon makes an example of another liberal, which certainly helped, but seeing as it's the same location that's shown in the music video, it makes the problem feel localized instead of giving us a fuller sense of scale. I gotta say though, Caitlyn seriously committed to the bit without any hesitation. Girls will have one bad breakup and suddenly there's nothing holding them back from becoming Führer of a fascist regime. But while we don't see her doing much of anything but training to master firebending and rebounding to a new redhead and just kind of clumsily playing along while Mbessa does the majority of the intimidation, her thinly expressed reservations about how much she doesn't like how bad things have gotten are pretty much the only things she contributes to the regime before she's switching sides after one encounter with her ex. Caitlyn was largely ignored throughout this arc, with all of her scenes being overshadowed by either the presence or mere mention of Mbessa. It felt like the writers were struggling not to just focus on Mbessa entirely, and while I understand that Mbessa's influence was the main catalyst for Caitlyn's behavior, the balance between their narratives put far more emphasis on Mbessa's warmongering than it did on Caitlyn's guilt, so that even though we got hints of Caitlyn's impending betrayal, it still felt undeserved to the point of comedy when a single chat with Vi was enough to completely turn her against Mbessa. If I wanted to be generous about it, I could say that maybe the intention was to focus on Mbessa while subtly hinting that Caitlyn was growing discontent with the cause so that it felt like her betrayal was something that had been looming in the background while Mbessa was busy obsessing over her missing daughter or controlling Piltover, but that would have only worked if Mbessa was demonstrably distracted. We get a couple of mentions regarding Mel's disappearance, but Mbessa seems primarily concerned with handling the war at hand, and that's not distracting her from Caitlyn either, because Mbessa is constantly breathing down Caitlyn's neck. Mbessa has been established as a severely competent manipulator, and that demands that she is highly attuned to the behavior of those around her. If Mbessa didn't have any doubts about Caitlyn, I feel unconvinced that I should have been anticipating it either. Of course it was something we all knew was going to happen, but this was not a case of something being predictable in a good way. While I previously praised the specific sequence of Vi's capture for being a well-framed double-crossing, when presented in the larger context of Caitlyn's character arc throughout this season, the only reason we were able to designate any believability to that capture at all was because we really weren't given sufficient reason to believe Caitlyn would sacrifice her standing with Mbessa and, by extension, the entirety of Piltover's standing authority just to help Vi save Vander. Overall, I think one of this act's greatest weaknesses was how it neglected Caitlyn's arc, especially because becoming Supreme Leader Kierman is kind of a huge fucking jump that's going to take some serious character development to recover from. While we're on the topic of Caitlyn, I want to comment on her dynamic with Jinx. Sorry, but the last time they were relevant to each other, Caitlyn wanted that girl tarred and feathered in the town square. Her entire crusade this whole season has been a hunt for Jinx, and even though they only really encountered each other at the very end during that heartfelt family reunion, I have a hard time believing that Caitlyn would be happy to stand back and let that happen just because Jinx didn't rise to the bait. But then I find it unbelievable that she would drop everything to help Vi after betraying her so suddenly at the end of Act 1, so I guess Caitlyn is just chronically unable to commit to anything. I can honestly make arguments for and against the Jinx and Vi reunion, and the primary factors oscillate between it being an issue of their characters or of the contrived nature of the narrative surrounding it. Even though this show has never really demonstrated to me that they actually wanted to kill each other, it did at least try to dig its heels in on the point that they believed there was no other way to solve their problems than to do just that. However, that was back in Season 1, where Vi was entangled with the Piltover perspective thanks to Caitlyn's intervention, and where Jinx worked under Silco. With both Caitlyn and Silco out of the picture, Vi and Jinx were able to reunite under more neutral circumstances. While this in a vacuum makes sense to me, my suspension of disbelief is straining under the conditions that got us to this point. A big part of it is the pacing, and how we sped through or altogether skipped that big chunk of story that took place between the end of Season 1 and now. Another part of it is that Vi just up and abandoned the fight for justice and went on a months-long self-destructive bender somewhere that I don't think was supposed to be Piltover, but to be honest, it's kind of hard to tell because her drinking buddy was there for some of it. I'm having a hard time placing where exactly she is and how much she's distanced herself from the enforcers, which is important information for the viewer to have in order to judge how far removed she is from their cause. She hasn't taken up any supplementary solo crusade to stop Jinx, and I don't know if it's because she doesn't care anymore, or she doesn't think Jinx is a threat and or her problem, or because she's suddenly remembered that she's always wanted freedom for the Undercity and is happy to let it play out. She's busy getting drunk over a bad breakup, and we don't actually spend enough time with her to understand what she wants anymore other than that. Alternatively, we are getting so much Jinx this season, and while I definitely enjoyed getting to spend time with one character's plotline instead of jumping all over the place trying to cover our bases, I still had a hard time reconciling the Jinx we got this season with the Jinx that ended season 1. Now, obviously season 1 treated Jinx like a weapon that Silco was more or less aiming at his enemies, so it made sense that when he died, she would lack direction. But Silco had also spent years refining her for his cause, grooming her to be loyal to him to the point of emotional dependence, and it's obvious in so many ways that she really did love him as her father. So while it makes sense to me that losing him would force Jinx into an independence that she doesn't know how to handle, I have a hard time reconciling that specific catalyst with the listless person she seems to have become. In Act 1, we jump right into a Jinx post-time skip who wanders the streets anonymously and without purpose. She doesn't seem to be doing much of anything until Savika shows up, and then they team up not necessarily to take up Silco's mantle, but to take down Caitlyn and Vi. After that literally blows up, we jump ahead a few months to discover that Jinx, despite apparent constant pressure from Savika, has abandoned the cause altogether to hang out with her new bestie Isha. Now, maybe the issue is that Jinx never really cared for the cause to begin with. She was always just doing as Silco asked in as much as it pleased her, which is why she was such a loose cannon. But watching the season 1 finale where, after killing Silco, Jinx solidifies her identity as Jinx and commits to war on Piltover by bombing the council house, I got the sense that she was doubling down, not giving up. I massively suspect that this is because plans for further seasons were cut, but we seem to go from Jinx declaring war to Jinx giving up overnight. This is all therefore to say. Jinx seems way too tame for the point we're at in the story. Her psychosis seems to have largely died down, where I would have expected Silco dying to destabilize her more. Yes, I understand that her relationship with Isha has been very healing for her. I understand that Silco isn't around to radicalize her, and that Savika doesn't have the same sway over her that he did. That said, Jinx is being uncharacteristically chill about Vi siding with Caitlyn, something that she previously perceived as the utmost betrayal, and which was a major trigger for her hallucinations in the past. Instead, she's over here bantering about it like it's not that big of a deal.
Wish I was just seeing things when you decided to throw him with the Pilty goons who murdered Mom and Dad.
I'm not saying that's not something Jinx could ever do. I'm saying that I don't feel like enough character or narrative development has passed for her to be able to do it just yet, and the fact that she is handling it this well instead makes me feel like a vital piece of her character has been forgotten about for the sake of moving the story towards its conclusion. Also, where did Savika go? We got this awesome prison break with her and Jinx, and then she disappears. I was confused about why Jinx didn't bring up the Vander situation to her, or why we at least didn't get to see a scene of her debating whether to talk to her about it, because yeah, Savika probably would have just said to kill him, but that conversation would have at least given Jinx more of a reason to talk to Vi about it than a sudden rush of critical self-reflection that, again, I don't think Jinx has developed enough to achieve over the course of 4 episodes. It's possible that I'm also just complaining because I think Savika is hands down the hottest character in the entire show, but yeah, not having more of her was a huge miss for me. Throughout all of this, Mel is hanging out in Hanaaki prison with this evil vision of her dead brother who for some reason is really intent on delivering an entire expository dialogue on their family history. The reason of course being that the viewer needs to be caught up on a whole ton of shit in order for the rest of Mel's story to make sense. I'm simultaneously grateful and annoyed that we didn't spend much time with her during this arc because I don't have a huge personal interest in her character outside of how it relates to the larger narrative, but that also doesn't mean I'm willing to excuse that level of hand-waving to a character who was built up so beautifully in season 1. All in all, I don't have much to say about her because there really wasn't that much to talk about to begin with. Since my last video, I have learned that the side characters that took so much effort to wedge into the narrative have literally no relevance in the video game, which, as one commenter succinctly put it, is worse. Not only that, but they make almost no relevant appearances throughout this arc, if they appear at all. Looking at you, Fishman. Or, I would be if you were there. The drunkard drinks some more and then fucks off. Maddie gets to hit the brutal dictator of Piltover and contributes so minimally as Caitlyn's voice of reason that she might as well not even be there to begin with. I saw someone on Twitter say something about how that's just what a side character is, but that interpretation is willfully ignoring the amount of effort and setup that it took to establish these side characters in the first place. Official Vistaria writing tip number 1. Do not add characters that you don't need in your story just for the sake of having them there, and especially don't designate them entire fight scenes if they don't actually matter. Y'all could have been my freedom fighters. Fishman was serving such intense long shot that I was actually interested in what he might contribute to the narrative. But instead of adding anything, all they did was take away from the characters we already cared about. So thanks for that, I guess. So, like, he's gonna be back in 3 days, right? Like, Victor's whole thing this arc has been about
the final, glorious evolution.
and out-of-body experiences, so I find it really hard to believe that he's actually gone for good. Killing off the Hex Core could not have been that easy, because then what would our faithful scientists even do for the rest of the story? I'm sure he's fine. Is it just me, or do they all have some weird sexual tension going on? I don't know. I just hated this scene. A lot of it has to do with my personal ick surrounding pregnancy talk, but I think even outside of that, I just found the dialogue really cheesy and kind of awkward.
I don't care if you have to carve it out of the bedrock covered in blisters.
I will say though, I think it's interesting to compare how Vander and Silco both went about trying to keep this promise. Vander locked in on the part about protecting the children, where Silco perceived the creation of Zahn as the primary takeaway.
What's the point if we can't raise an ankle biter or two?
To Zahn, then.
It frames their conflicting behaviors in a new light. Both were trying to raise their respective inherited daughters the way they thought best aligned with the wishes of their dead mother. The problem is that both of them neglected the bigger picture. Shielding Vi and Powder from the world and maintaining the status quo might have been safer, but it guarantees they are raised in a world that never improves. Focusing on the formation of Zahn ensures that there is a better future for the children to look forward to, but it risks their security in the present. Vander and Silco found themselves at either extreme and were never able to come together to work out a way to achieve both. I feel that Vi and Jinx were set up to start on either side of this extreme, and that their narratives were largely intended to follow the question of what if things had been done differently, gradually enough that they could come together and ensure a brighter future without sacrificing everything to achieve it. I also feel that this very explicit statement after reading Vander's letter,
If he found this, everything might have been different.
was kind of used to force that point for the viewers, since we again weren't able to get the seasons of build-up that the pacing of season 1 anticipated. Vander's and Isha's involvements in this arc were two pivotal aspects that I really want to just turn my brain off and enjoy, and in the moment while I was watching the show, I was able to really appreciate the emotion they provided to the story. But again, this wouldn't be a critical video if I was the kind of person who was content to leave it at that. We all knew Vander was coming back as Warwick, but I have many complaints about the pacing. His revival was built up slowly over the course of Act 1, and while on their own I actually enjoyed those scenes because they were a rare example of Season 2 slowing down on its rapid-fire delivery of one plot point to the next, they just kind of set me up with the expectation that Vander was going to be a lot more involved in the rest of the season than it appears he's going to be. If he really is dead for real this time, then it seems that the only relevance he had was as a narrative device to force Vi and Jinx back together in a non-violent context so that they could work through their family trauma, and I've just come to expect better than that from Arcane. Killing off a character after they've achieved their narrative goal just to get them out of the way for the next arc is a pretty frustrating way to tie up loose ends, and unlike Isha, Vander's death doesn't seem to me like it's going to add a new level of trauma. Like, yeah, it's sad and it's hard to think your dad is back from the dead for like 24 hours before he dies again, but the pacing of it all just didn't give them enough time together for me to feel like this is going to impact them in a way that would be more significant to their characters than his survival would have been. Obviously, nothing is confirmed until Act 3 drops, but just let it be known that if Vander really is dead for good, I'm kind of just over it. Oh, baby girl. The writing was on the wall, but I didn't want to believe it. I loved Isha way more this season. I was doing a fair amount of bitching about her in my last video because Act 1 really didn't give us much of her in a way that felt relevant. She was kind of just there until suddenly she was involved in the pivotal final battle, and then we time skipped to her and Jinx being sisters. A development I loved, don't get me wrong, but I'm a really hard sell on the timeline of events. Isha was established as a motivator for Jinx both to heal and to protect the Undercity. She is heavy-handedly held up as this mirror for Jinx to look into and see her younger self, to the point that she comes full circle by pocketing the Hextech orbs and blowing up Vander, and this time taking all remnants of Powder with her. This wasn't a bad idea, but the pacing forces us to get attached to her really quickly, and because she has such massive narrative significance, the writers are only really able to focus on the parts of her that contribute to that narrative significance. She's a narrative device, but that's all she is, because we don't know anything about her beyond how she exists in the context of her life with Jinx. She has no backstory, so we don't have to worry about her motivations other than how she helps Jinx. She doesn't speak, so she's limited on how she expresses herself beyond how it's related by Jinx. Isha comes into the story effectively as a blank slate for Jinx to impress herself upon, so she doesn't actually end up being much more than a cute little sister figure that hangs around for a bit before she blows herself up. And even that suicide is just another reflection of Jinx. Every heroic act that Jinx has performed in front of Isha has been a suicidal last stand, so of course Isha's primary takeaway is that she should save people by dying. Whether or not this ends up being a wake-up call for Jinx remains to be seen, but I would be surprised if after staring for 3 episodes into a metaphorical mirror, she doesn't realize that she probably shouldn't be trying to kill herself all the time. When I think back to Milo and Claggor, who only had 3 episodes to contribute to before they similarly died, I come away feeling like those characters had more depth because they were written to be characters before they were a narrative tool, and I feel like the opposite was true in Isha's case. I wish Isha had been given proper attention in Act 1 so that I could have appreciated her more before she died. Her death was still impactful, but because all of her significance was relegated to this arc, her significance ends up feeling contained within the Act 2 narrative instead of resonating through the season the way I feel like it was intended to since she was introduced in Act 1. Make no mistake though, I was appropriately devastated by her death. Narrative device or not, that was my baby, and they killed her. Oh shit, what's Savika going to say? I was actually expecting this video to be shorter, but it doesn't look like that's the case. Oh well. Overall, my biggest criticism is still the pacing, and while I much prefer how this season made the effort to slow down, it's still reeling from the damage done by Act 1. I'm holding out hope for a better ending, but at this point I honestly can't even predict how that would look. Thanks for stopping in for part 2 of what is looking like a 3-part series about Season 2 of Arcane, and don't forget to smash that subscribe. Can you fucking leave, please?